one of the events coordinator for WUSC at Ontario Tech. Today, we will be talking to two wonderful guest speakers, Jennifer Bing and Jehad Abusalim from the American Friends Service Committee on the Free Palestine hashtag and the current injustices resulting from the Israeli occupation of Palestine. We greatly appreciate both for taking the time to be on our podcast today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Now, to begin, could you please take a moment to briefly tell the audience more about yourselves?
It's a pleasure to join you all. My name is Jehad Abusalim. I'm from Palestine, specifically from Gaza. I moved to the US 7 years ago to start a PhD program in history at New York University. In 2018, I moved to Chicago from New York, so from a great city to another great city. Shortly after I moved to Chicago, I started working with the American Friends Service Committee's Palestine Activism Program, where I work as the Education and Policy Associate, focusing on doing advocacy work for Palestine in general, and specifically on a campaign called Gaza Unlocked, which I will talk about later. But yeah, I grew up in Palestine, in Gaza. I spent most of my life there. I still have family there. And I now have family here in the US. So I have connections and roots in both worlds. And it's a great pleasure to be with you today.
Thanks, Jehad. My name's Jennifer Bing, and I first went to Palestine as a student in the early 1980s and later returned there to be a volunteer teacher teaching Palestinian students in the West Bank. And I came back to the United States in 1989 to work on the issue of Palestinian human rights and to try to really change the discourse about Palestine. Even at that time, using the word Palestine, much less the hashtag Free Palestine. We didn't have hashtags back then, but
that was a pleasure to meet you. And now I'd like to ask if you could briefly describe to us the history of this Israeli occupation in Palestine for those who may not be fully aware of this issue.
Sure. Palestine is, an area that is located in the southwestern region of Asia. It's Africa's gate to Asia and Asia's gate to Africa. It's been for thousands of years a place that has been inhabited by many people, many groups, many civilizations. It's perhaps considered one of the places where the earliest instances of human settlement has begun more than 10,000 years ago. So Palestinian history is a mosaic of cultural and human interaction for a very, very long time. Moving fast forward to the modern era, by the beginning of the 20th century, the area of Palestine today that consists of Israel proper, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, have always been for hundreds of years an Arab country inhabited by a majority Arab population, Muslims and Christians who speak Arabic, who belong to a broader region also that embraces Arabic culture, Arab culture, Islamic culture, and Eastern Christian traditions. In the beginning of the 20th century, those people who lived in Palestine, as they were trying to seek independence like neighboring nations and establishing their own state, Jewish people in Europe were undergoing great oppression at the hands of anti-Semitic forces in Europe. And one of the ways that Jewish communities in Europe imagined the emancipation of Jews there was through the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. Now, of course, this is where things get complicated and tricky. for Jewish communities who also believe that they have a connection to the land, establishing a Jewish majority state in Palestine was not something that can be done easily, because the country has been inhabited. There's already a population there that is rooted culturally, politically, with its institution and culture, and so on and so forth. So in the late 19th, early 20th century, a movement emerged in Europe called the Zionist movement. And the goal of that movement was that to establish a Jewish majority state in Palestine through colonization and settlement. And eventually this political, modern, secular, nationalist movement allied itself with colonial imperialist forces like Great Britain, which, we're talking about a period, the high noon of imperialism and colonialism. We are familiar with the extent to which Britain was colonizing the world in the early 20th century, late 19th century. So eventually Palestine during World War I falls under British control, and then the British took upon themselves to facilitate the immigration of Jews from Europe, and to facilitate the establishment of institutions, of structures that would favor the Zionist movement, and that would eventually lead to the establishment of the State of Israel. Of course, this moment, the birth of the State of Israel, happened at the expense of the Palestinian people. The establishment of the State of Israel was a violent event. It led to uprooting hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, whose descendants, millions of them now, live as refugees all over the world. And it led to the destruction of Palestinian society, Palestinian economy, Palestinian politics, and Palestinian culture. And it's been a process of settlement and colonization, land grab, and violent transformation of the country that has been taking decades and has caused so much pain for Palestinians.
Well, thank you, Jehad, for that excellent encapsulation of informative knowledge to us, having to understand the history and the current events happening in Palestine right now. It truly is valuable for us audience to know about and understand more on why this is such an important pressing issue. And now, you mentioned that in your Palestinian activism program, you had this petition running for Palestinian children. Would you like to speak more about that?
Yes, thank you. I would like to talk about it. The No Way to Treat a Child campaign, which is one of the campaigns that we work on, was actually launched to bring attention to just one facet of Israeli occupation, which is the detention and prosecution of Palestinian children aged between 12 and 18 years old in Israeli military courts. Human rights organizations and relief organizations like UNICEF, Human Rights Watch, Defense for Children International Palestine, Amnesty International, B'Tselem, all these organizations have documented for years the widespread and systematic ill treatment and torture of Palestinian children by the Israeli army. Since 1967, Israel has operated two separate legal systems in the same territory. So in the occupied West Bank, Israeli settlers are subject to civilian and criminal legal system, whereas Palestinians living in the same territory live under military law. So in the West Bank, 45% of the population are children under the age of 18. And since the year 2000, an estimated 10,000 children have been detained by the Israeli authorities. Documentation shows a pattern where children typically arrive to Israeli interrogation bound, blindfolded, frightened, and sleep deprived. As in over half of the cases, children are taken from their homes by the Israeli army in the middle of the night. Children often give confessions after verbal abuse, threats, physical and psychological violence that in some cases amounts to torture. Children are routinely held in solitary confinement for interrogation purposes to psychologically break and coerce them into confessing. Israeli military law provides no legal right to legal counsel during interrogation, and the Israeli military court judges seldom exclude confessions obtained by coercion or torture. Military courts have a 99% conviction rate. We believe these practices are no way to treat a child, thus the name of our campaign. We work to influence audiences and decision makers in an effort to end Israeli military occupation and secure a just and viable future for Palestinian children. We believe that all children should have rights in accordance with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and other international standards.
Now, I'd like to ask if you would be delighted to share any of your firsthand personal stories, whether it be witnessing, living the experience, or finding out about the consequent impacts of this Israeli occupation in Palestine.
Absolutely. I mean, as I mentioned, I lived in Gaza for most of my life. Violence is a daily story. Sometimes, when I think about now that I'm here in the US, I have the ability to take a step back and reflect on what my life looked like there. When you live in a place where you have access to 4 to 6 hours of electricity a day, when you live in a place where you have to count how many showers you can take per week, when you live in a place where water is not guaranteed, or water can get you sick because it's polluted, when you live in a place where if you get a scholarship like I did, and having just to do something like applying for a US visa, right, which required a trip to Jerusalem that, if there was no occupation, would take an hour and a half, 2 hours, but I had to spend months waiting for an Israeli permit just to get a one-day permit for 7 hours, just to go to the American embassy in Jerusalem, do the interview, and go back to Gaza same day. That in itself took 6 months just to get a one-day permit. When you think about people who have cancer, right, and who need medical treatment outside of Gaza, and who are put on very long waiting lists. When you think about, like the campaign my colleague Jennifer mentioned, about children who are being arrested in the middle of the night by invading soldiers and barking dogs, who are taken to detention centers and interrogated in a language that they don't speak and are traumatized. The combination of all these details make the entire experience of people who live in Palestine a violent one. One story that I can never forget, one experience that I can never ever forget, was when on December 27, 2008, when it was a Saturday at 11:43 a.m. Gaza time, I was about to step out of my college department building, and on my way out, I just submitted my written assignment because electricity, you can't really do that online. You can't have a reliable online system. At least then, as I was about to leave the building, the earth started to shake, the glass started to shatter. I thought it was an earthquake. I rushed outside the building, and I look around me, and I saw these pillars of fire and cloud rising from every corner around me. And then I hear these very strong explosions. That was the beginning of an operation that Israel called Cast Lead. And I looked around, the smoke, the fire, and everything. In that moment, there was a Palestinian police graduation ceremony just across the street. And in that moment, more than 150 people were killed. And as I was trying to run for my life with my, friends from school, we were seeing the survivors coming out of that police compound that was just hit. And, we were seeing people with like ashes and blood and so on. That was an unforgettable day in my life. The war continued for 21 days afterwards. It took the lives of 1,400 people. There were many uncertain things about that experience, but the only certain thing was that one could die at any moment. And that was just, a day I was very excited about. I was planning to have coffee with my classmates from school after we submit our assignments and just, go home at the end, talk about the most recent movies or TV shows that we liked or whatever. So I survived that day. If I left just 10 minutes earlier and walked down the street where the police ceremony was hit, I don't know if I would have stayed alive. But this is just one experience, and it really leaves its impact. It's on you for the rest of your life. It changes you. Some people, it changes you for the best or for the worst. The lesson I took from that experience was that someone has got to do something about the situation. Someone has got to do something and change the reality and prevent things like that from happening again. Other people, of course, they're left with wounds that are really hard to heal and recover. And to add insult to injury, people my generation in Gaza, and older and younger, had to witness 2 additional military operations, one in 2012 and one in 2014, that exceeded any other thing that people have known in terms of its intensity and the amount of firepower that has been. So these experiences continue. These experiences will not stop unless we take action, unless we do something about what's happening.
Well, thank you again, Jehad, for that courageous sharing of your story, and we truly appreciate that. Having to vividly describe and explain it to us is valuable. And now, finally, after everything that you've both shared, I'd like to ask one last question. What is the key message that you would want our audience to take away from this podcast?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. I mean, just hearing Jehad's story and, having the privilege of all of us to be a witness to the suffering of Palestinians, I think that should motivate us to figure out ways that we can talk about Palestine. I mentioned that there are children held in solitary confinement. Right now, there is a petition to Prime Minister Trudeau in Canada and also to new President Biden, calling on them to demand that Israel stop using solitary confinement against Palestinian children. The kind of repercussions that has of being detained and not having your rights met, it has lasting effect on entire society and children. So we hope that on the nowaytotreatachild.org, if you go to that website, you can see that there are 2 petitions, one about solitary confinement and another about children during COVID. We haven't talked about COVID, but in the news this month, there's been a lot of conversation about the great work that Israel is doing to vaccine its citizens in Israel. What's the part of the story that isn't being told is how those vaccines and healthcare is being denied to the Palestinians, the 5 million Palestinians that live in Gaza and the West Bank. So I hope that all of our listeners and viewers today will really make an effort to learn more, to hear more stories, and to take what you learn and try to educate others. So I appreciate that we were able to join you today.
Again, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you so much, Jennifer and Jehad, for sharing with us your valuable wisdom, expertise, and narratives on this current situation going on in Palestine. Your hard work and your dedication to this important cause is truly admirable and even inspirational.
Thank you so much for giving us this wonderful opportunity to convey the message and to talk to your audiences and to you. It's an honor, and we look forward to future conversations.
Yes, thank you so much.
This is Kiara from WUSC at Ontario Tech. Thank you for listening to our podcast. Let's talk about the hashtag Free Palestine.
What is WUSC's perspective of the Gaza unlocked situation? For over a decade, 2 million Palestinians in Gaza have lived under a military blockade imposed by Israel. The blockade has especially hurt the educational prospects of students of all ages in Gaza. Thousands of college-age students are barred from finishing their education because they are denied permission to leave Gaza to study elsewhere. Gaza is facing school shortages, which is forcing nearly all public schools to hold 2 shifts each day, cutting students' learning time in half. Israel has banned the import of school supplies such as textbooks, pencils, lab equipment, computers, and paper in Gaza. That's terrible. And over 160,000 children in Gaza are estimated to be in need of continued psychological support, which impacts their education. Since WUSC is not a humanitarian aid relief organization, it is not directly involved in the prosecution and prevention of the Israeli government in the bearing of citizens of Gaza. However, WUSC works towards addressing and aiding refugees such as women and children, since the issues faced by Palestinians, especially students, align with the goals of WUSC. WUSC in many parts of the world can aid these refugees who seek employment through training or education through the Student Refugee Program. What is WUSC's connection to Palestine? WUSC works in partnership with international organizations such as the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, which manages a formal Palestinian refugee camp heavily populated by Palestinians. WUSC has also identified that consequent to this forced displacement, race and gender-based discrimination and financial constraints are some factors why Palestinian refugees, especially young women, can't pursue higher education. Their lack of documents certifying legal national status acts as a barrier to accessing education and contributes to their low university enrollment in their country of refugee. Therefore, WUSC first introduced the Student Refugee Program to the Middle East in 1984, where they continue to aid youth in urgent need of a durable solution for resettlement and opportunities to continue their post-secondary education. What is WUSC's perspective of the children of Palestine? The children of Palestine have been affected by the Palestine-Israel government in a number of ways, including witnessing violence around their homes, and attacks against schools, and a fear of being killed themselves. Palestine also faces a socioeconomic crisis with the rise of poverty and children dropping out of school at a younger age. National responses from the Palestinian government lack the resources to protect children and thus are reliant on international support. Palestinian children are also subjected to harassment and mistreatment from the Israeli government, with children ages 12 to 17 being detained by the Israel military force. As children are a vulnerable target, their possibilities of having access to a lawyer and their voices being heard are nearly next to impossible. It's so sad. WUSC also recognizes the many challenges youth face, including poverty, socioeconomic crisis, and war-stricken environments. A huge focus in WUSC's work is providing a right to an education, economic opportunities, and empowerment, creating a better future for youth, especially young women and refugees in Palestine. How does the crisis in Palestine affect WUSC's work? WUSC works to ensure youth around the world receive opportunities to secure a good quality of life for themselves, their family, and their community. Such opportunities are what can help Palestinian youth grow while also adding to build the Palestinian government.